It was a typical bustling afternoon at LAX, the sprawling airport where thousands of travelers make their way through security lines, terminals, and busy gates every day. Barron Trump, at 17, was sitting near Gate 37, scrolling through his phone, trying to blend in with the crowd. The tall teenager, his frame uncomfortably squeezed into a chair clearly too small for his height, seemed like any other passenger heading to his destination. His expression was neutral, calm. After all, traveling was routine for him, just another part of the life he'd known growing up in the public eye. But today, something was about to shake up the usual monotony of a flight. Barron had hoped for a quiet departure, to slip under the radar and avoid the usual attention that came with being the son of a former president. Yet, fate had other plans. The loudspeaker overhead announced the final boarding call for a flight to New York. People began moving toward the gate, the hum of conversations filling the air. Barron remained seated, his focus still on his phone. He had a first-class ticket, the kind of flight that allowed him to enjoy some peace and quiet far away from the crowd. He wasn't one to make a scene or attract attention, but as luck would have it, today was about to change that. An older gate agent, his face stern and his movements impatient, suddenly approached Barron. The agent's sharp gaze fell on him, eyeing the teenager with an air of suspicion. Barron didn't think much of it at first. He was just another traveler after all. But the agent's next words cut through the noise of the terminal. "Excuse me, young man." The agent's voice was clipped, his tone colder than necessary. "Are you sure you're in the right boarding group?" Barron looked up, startled but composed. He had dealt with questions like these before, though rarely so bluntly. "Yes, I'm in first class," Barron responded evenly, his voice calm yet polite. It was the truth, after all, and he had nothing to hide. The agent's eyes flicked to Barron's casual attire, his hoodie, sneakers, and the phone in his hand, and then to the boarding pass Barron had casually placed on the chair beside him. The agent paused for a moment, eyeing Barron suspiciously as if looking for something more. Finally, his voice broke the silence again. "Can I see your ticket?" Barron, already feeling a bit uneasy, handed over his boarding pass without hesitation. "Here," he said, as he passed it over to the agent, still trying to keep his cool. "Barron Trump," the agent read aloud, his eyes suddenly flicking up from the ticket to Barron's face. There was a momentary flicker of recognition in the agent's expression, a brief moment where something shifted, but instead of backing off, his demeanor seemed to harden. "Wait here," he said, his voice now firmer, his gaze unyielding. Confusion and unease washed over Barron. The agent turned and walked off, but not alone. A supervisor appeared by his side, and together they approached Barron with a sense of purpose. The murmurs from passengers grew louder, and Barron could feel the heat creeping up his neck. He remained calm, though, trying to ignore the growing spectacle. The supervisor didn't waste any time. "There seems to be an issue with your ticket," he said with a stern face. "You'll need to step aside while we sort this out." Barron's brow furrowed. "What issue? I booked this flight weeks ago." His patience was beginning to wear thin. He wasn't used to this kind of treatment, not when everything had been in order, but as the supervisor insisted, his frustration grew. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're going to have to ask you to wait here," the supervisor added, his tone implying that Barron had no say in the matter. "We'll resolve this shortly." As Barron moved aside reluctantly, the whispers among the crowd only grew louder. People were now recording the interaction on their phones, some muttering among themselves. Barron couldn't help but wonder, was this about his name, or was there something more to it? He had flown through this airport many times before, never once having an issue. But now, as he watched others board without a hitch, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a simple mistake. The minutes stretched on as Barron stood, watching as passengers around him moved through the gate without incident. He could feel the stares of the gate staff and the growing murmurs from the crowd. Their curiosity piqued. He shifted uneasily, unsure of what was taking so long. or why this was happening to him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the supervisor returned, his expression still stern. "We're unable to verify your identity through the system," he said flatly. "Do you have another form of identification?" Barron's mind raced. "My passport is in my carry-on bag," he replied, his tone now tinged with disbelief. "You didn't even check it?" The supervisor paused, clearly caught off guard by Barron's logical response, but instead of backing off, he only doubled down. "This isn't just about your ID. There are procedures we need to follow." "Procedures?" Barron echoed, his patience all but gone. "I've flown through this airport dozens of times without a problem. What's going on here?" The gate agent jumped in, his voice now a little defensive. "We've had some irregularities lately. It's not just you. Everyone's being checked carefully. You're not being singled out." Barron wasn't buying it. His instincts told him something more was at play here, something deeper. Meanwhile, the murmurs around him continued to build. A woman nearby, holding a toddler, spoke up. "What's the problem?" she asked. "He's just a kid with a ticket. Let him board." But the supervisor ignored her, focusing only on Barron. And as the minutes dragged on, Barron knew this wasn't just about his ticket anymore. Something else was happening, and it felt personal. Barron stood there, his hands gripping his carry-on bag, his patience wearing thin as the minutes stretched on. The terminal buzzed around him, people rushing to make their flights, chatter filling the air, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. His ticket was fine. His identity was verified. So why was he still standing here? Why was this taking so long? And more importantly, why did it feel like something was off? As he stood waiting, Barron couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to this situation than just a ticket discrepancy. His mind raced, replaying the interaction with the gate agent. The man had approached him with suspicion in his eyes, questioning Barron's right to be in the priority boarding section. That wasn't normal. Was this really about a ticket issue, or was it something else? Was he being treated differently because of who he was, or perhaps because of his last name? The whispers from fellow passengers grew louder, and Barron could feel their eyes on him. A woman nearby murmured, "That's Barron Trump, right? What's he doing here?" Another person pulled out their phone to snap a picture. Barron didn't flinch. He had grown used to the constant attention. But today was different. Today, he was just a teenager, trying to get on his flight. Just like everyone else, he shouldn't be in the spotlight like this. A few minutes later, the supervisor returned, his expression no softer than before. Barron tried to remain calm, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. "We're still unable to verify your identity," the supervisor said, his voice still carrying that tone of authority that had been grating on Barron's nerves since this whole ordeal began. "Do you have another form of ID?" Barron took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "I already told you," he replied, his voice steady but laced with a hint of frustration. "My passport is in my carry-on bag. You didn't even check it. Why didn't you just ask for it in the first place?" The supervisor hesitated, caught off guard by Barron's calm yet logical response. He looked over at the gate agent, who was standing a few feet away, and then back at Barron. "We're following procedures," the supervisor said, though his words now seemed weaker, less convincing. "Procedures?" Barron echoed, incredulously creeping into his voice. "I've flown out of this airport dozens of times with no problem. You've had my ticket and passport for over 20 minutes now. What's really going on here?" The supervisor shifted uncomfortably. He didn't have an answer, at least not one that made sense. "It's just a precautionary measure," he muttered, but Barron wasn't buying it. Another passenger, a man standing nearby, had been watching the entire exchange. He couldn't take it anymore. "What's the deal with this kid?" the man asked, shaking his head. "He's got a first-class ticket. What are you doing?" The supervisor's face flushed red with embarrassment, but he said nothing in response. The tension in the air was palpable, and Barron could feel the weight of everyone's gaze, as if the whole terminal had turned its focus on him. He shifted uncomfortably, wishing he could just get on the plane and leave all of this behind. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse, a pair of airport security officers appeared. Barron's chest tightened, his jaw clenched in disbelief. He didn't feel afraid. He was beyond that. But he felt something else: confusion, frustration, and a growing sense that he was being treated unfairly. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us," one of the officers said in a calm but firm tone. "We just need to ask you a few questions." Barron exhaled sharply, his frustration bubbling over. He had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. But here he was, being escorted by security like a criminal. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He grabbed his carry-on bag and followed the officers as they led him away from the gate. The whispers and camera flashes followed him down the corridor, and Barron could hear the murmurs growing louder. People were talking about him, judging him, assuming the worst. It was like he had become a spectacle, a moment for everyone to gawk at. Once inside a small, sterile room near the gate, Barron was asked to sit at a table. The officers went through his passport once again, flipping through the pages like they were looking for something suspicious. Barron was beyond frustrated at this point. His patience had worn thin, and the situation was beginning to feel like something more than just a misunderstanding. "This is insane," Barron said, his voice barely above a whisper as he looked around the room, his mind racing. He could feel the heaviness of the moment, the sense of being trapped in a situation that didn't make sense. One of the officers looked up from the passport, clearly sensing Barron's frustration. "We're just following protocol, son," the officer said, his voice low, but something about the way he said it felt like an excuse, a way to justify their actions without truly explaining them. Barron could tell that the officers were uncomfortable, but that only added to his unease. As the officers stepped out of the room to verify Barron's credentials, the silence in the room felt suffocating. Barron sat there, alone, staring at the blank walls. He didn't know who to call. He didn't know what to do. All he wanted was to get on his flight and go home. But it was clear now that he wasn't going anywhere until someone explained why he was being treated this way. What Barron didn't know, however, was that someone was on their way to the airport who would change everything. As Barron sat there in the cold, sterile room, his mind was racing. The minutes felt like hours. What was going on? Why was this happening to him? He had done everything right. His ticket was legitimate. His identity had been verified countless times before. But now here he was, being treated like a criminal, surrounded by airport security and a sea of whispers from curious onlookers. His frustration grew by the second, and he could feel the walls closing in. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The seconds seemed to drag on, each one heavier than the last. The officer who had taken his passport had left the room, but Barron was still unsure of what was happening. He had done nothing wrong. There was no reason for this. The other passengers had moved on, boarding their flights without issue, and yet Barron was stuck in this strange, uncomfortable limbo. The door opened with a soft click, and the supervisor from earlier stepped inside, looking uneasy. "We're still working on clearing up the situation," he said, his voice slightly more nervous than before. "It shouldn't be much longer." Barron couldn't keep the frustration from spilling over. "How much longer? I've given you all my information. You've had my ticket and passport for almost an hour now. What else do you need?" The supervisor hesitated, mumbling something about procedures again, but it was clear to Barron that the words didn't make sense anymore. "This isn't about procedures," Barron said sharply, his voice rising. "It's about respect. You've been holding me here for no reason." The supervisor didn't respond. Instead, he awkwardly shifted on his feet and backed out of the room, leaving Barron alone again. The silence felt deafening now. Barron's thoughts swirled. Was it really his last name that had caused this? Was this some kind of punishment? He had been flying for years, traveling around the world without ever being questioned like this. Why was this moment different? What Barron didn't know was that things were about to take a dramatic turn. In the back seat of a sleek black SUV weaving through the busy streets of Los Angeles, Melania Trump was receiving a flood of notifications. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, and as she glanced down, her expression shifted from calm to concern. One message caught her attention, and it made her stomach drop. Something's going on with Barron at the airport. People are posting videos. Melania's fingers moved quickly across her phone screen, pulling up a clip that showed her son Barron being surrounded by security officers and led away from the gate. She replayed it twice, her brow furrowing deeper with each pass. The sense of anger and disbelief grew within her. This wasn't right. This couldn't be happening. Without another thought, Melania turned to the driver. "Please, hurry," she said in a cool, firm voice, her calm demeanor masking the tension she was feeling inside. She had always maintained composure in public, but the thought of her son being treated this way, of being singled out, was too much to bear. As the SUV made its way toward the airport, Melania's thoughts were focused entirely on Barron. She couldn't believe what she had just seen. This wasn't just about a ticket. This was something much deeper, something personal. Barron didn't deserve this. He was a young man, trying to get on a flight, and yet here he was, trapped in a situation that made no sense. Back at the airport, Barron sat with his hands resting on the table in front of him, his eyes staring blankly at the wall. The minutes seemed to crawl, the weight of the situation making him feel smaller than he had ever felt. He had always tried to avoid drama, to stay out of the spotlight, but now it felt like the world was watching him, judging him. His last name had turned into a symbol of something larger, something that seemed to bring out the worst in people. But what Barron didn't know was that help was on the way. The sound of footsteps in the hallway grew louder, and suddenly the door opened. Barron looked up to see a familiar face. His mother, Melania Trump, walking into the room. Her presence was immediate, commanding, and the tension in the room shifted in an instant. The officers, caught off guard by her arrival, froze. Barron felt a surge of relief wash over him, though he kept his expression neutral. Melania's gaze swept across the room, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. Without missing a beat, she turned to the officer standing closest to her. "What is going on here?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an underlying force that made it clear she wasn't going to accept anything less than a full explanation. The officer hesitated, fumbling for words. "This is just a standard protocol, ma'am," he said, but Melania wasn't having it. She cut him off before he could continue, her voice steady but sharp. "Protocol? You're holding my son in a small room with no explanation, and you're calling it protocol?" The supervisor, who had been lingering at the door, quickly stepped forward, his face pale as he realized who was standing before him. "Mrs. Trump, this is all just a misunderstanding," he stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. "We were just trying to verify his ticket, but it's taking longer than expected." "Misunderstanding?" Melania echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Let me ask you something. Do you treat all passengers this way? Or is it just the ones you decide don't belong in first class?" The supervisor was speechless. Melania's piercing gaze locked onto him, and he was suddenly aware that this was no longer a minor inconvenience. It was a situation that demanded accountability. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Barron sat straighter in his chair, his shoulders lifting slightly. For the first time, in what felt like forever, he felt a small sense of relief. His mother was here. She would make it right. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their unease palpable. One of them cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. "It's standard procedure, ma'am," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "We weren't aware of your son's relation to you until just now." Melania's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. So this is about his last name? She asked, her voice cold. The supervisor tried to interject, but Melania raised a hand to silence him. Save your excuses. I want to speak to someone in charge, now. With the situation rapidly slipping out of their control, the supervisor nodded and left the room. Melania stood firm, her eyes locked onto Barron, offering him a brief but reassuring smile. Her words were calm, but the weight they carried was undeniable. We're going to fix this, she said quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Melania stood with a calm yet unwavering presence in the small room, her sharp gaze fixed on the airport supervisor. The tension in the air was thick, and Barron, who had been slumped in his chair, felt his shoulders relax just slightly at the sight of his mother. He hadn't realized how much weight had been bearing down on him until now, but with her arrival everything seemed to shift. This wasn't just about getting on a flight anymore. It was about something much bigger. Accountability. The supervisor, now visibly flustered, kept glancing back and forth between Melania and the officers who had been questioning Barron. His face was pale, and his attempts to defend the situation were only making things worse. He muttered, "We were just doing our job, ma'am. We didn't know who your son was until after the fact." Melania's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it that made it clear she wasn't going to let this slide. "So it took you this long to verify who he is?" she asked, her words deliberate. "And you chose to escalate the situation instead of handling it quietly and efficiently? You've humiliated my son in front of dozens of people. What kind of protocol is this?" The silence in the room was deafening. The air was so thick with tension it felt like time itself had stopped. The supervisor, now feeling the weight of Melania's words, took a step back. The officers standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that they had made a serious misstep. For a moment, it seemed like no one knew how to respond. Melania wasn't about to let them off the hook so easily. She took a deep breath, her composure never faltering. "This isn't just about Barron. It's about the principle of respect. The respect you failed to show him, and the respect you failed to show everyone else who was here today. What makes you think it's acceptable to treat someone this way, especially when they've done nothing wrong?" The supervisor opened his mouth to speak but found no words to counter her. He shifted nervously, glancing at the other employees who had gathered in the room, hoping for some form of support, but there was none. Melania's gaze never wavered. She wasn't here for an apology in private. She wasn't going to let this matter be swept under the rug. "You will address this publicly," she said, her voice steady and firm. "You will apologize for how my son was treated in front of all these people. This is about setting an example of what respect looks like, not just for my family, but for everyone who flies through this airport." Barron sat silently, but inside he was grateful. It was a quiet gratitude, the kind that didn't need to be vocalized. His mother had always taught him to stand tall, even when the world seemed unfair. And now, she was teaching him something else: how to hold people accountable when they've crossed the line. It wasn't long before the supervisor returned, this time with a higher-ranking airport official. The man extended his hand toward Melania, but she ignored it, her focus solely on the apology that had yet to be given. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding," the official began, trying to maintain some semblance of authority in the situation. "I assure you, we'll be reviewing this incident and taking appropriate action." Melania raised an eyebrow. "Appropriate action?" she repeated, her voice almost dripping with disbelief. "Does that include addressing the staff who escalated this without cause? Or reviewing the footage that clearly shows how this entire mess began?" The official faltered, and Barron couldn't help but notice the shift in the air. It was as if everyone in the room could feel the weight of the moment. The official hesitated but eventually nodded. "We can certainly pull up the footage, ma'am," he said, and his voice now lacked the confidence it had earlier. "Do it," Melania said, her words clipped but decisive. "And do it now." The official, clearly flustered, quickly stepped aside and began working on his laptop. A few moments later, he returned with the footage. The grainy video played out on the screen, showing Barron sitting calmly at the gate before being approached by the gate agent. It captured the exchange in full, from the unnecessary questioning to the escalating tension that led to Barron being removed from the gate. Melania watched the footage silently, her face unreadable. When it ended, she turned to the supervisor and the official with an icy gaze. "This was entirely your fault," she said, her voice steady but unwavering. "You humiliated my son, and now you will make it right." The supervisor, now visibly shaken, nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Trump. We'll address it immediately." Melania wasn't done. She turned to the crowd of passengers who had been quietly observing the entire exchange. She knew they had been watching, and she wasn't going to let this moment pass without making a statement. She walked to the front of the gate area, and the murmurs from the crowd grew louder as she did. The supervisor stepped forward and cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to apologize for the situation that occurred earlier today," he began, his voice shaky but sincere. "A misunderstanding involving one of our passengers, Mr. Barron Trump, led to actions that were unnecessary and inappropriate. For that, we deeply regret the inconvenience and discomfort caused." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some passengers exchanged surprised glances, while others nodded in agreement. Melania's eyes swept over the crowd, and as the supervisor continued, she couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. This wasn't just about Barron. This was about something much larger, making sure that every person who walked through that airport was treated with dignity. She stepped forward once more, her voice carrying over the terminal. "Thank you for your words," she said to the supervisor, "but words are not enough. Respect is not something that should be given only to those with power or status. It should be a fundamental right for every single person. Let this be a reminder to all of us that respect should never be conditional. It should never be about who you are or where you come from. It should be about who you are as a human being." As the crowd began to applaud, some standing in solidarity, Melania smiled faintly. This wasn't about the apology. This was about showing people what real accountability looked like, and ensuring that no one would ever have to feel small or unworthy again. This moment, she knew, would not just resonate in that terminal, but would echo far beyond it. The scene at the airport gate had shifted. What started as a tense, uncomfortable encounter had now become something else entirely, a lesson in respect, accountability, and the power of standing up for what's right. As the applause echoed through the terminal, Melania stood tall, her calm demeanor never wavering. She had just taken a stand for her son, but more importantly, for every person who had ever felt small or unimportant in a public space. Barron, still processing the whirlwind of events, stood silently beside her, his expression neutral. But inside, he was reflecting on something far more profound than the inconvenience of a missed flight. He had learned a lesson in dignity, and the impact of his mother's unwavering presence in that moment was something he would never forget. The supervisor, his face still flushed with embarrassment, stepped aside as Melania and Barron moved toward the gate. They had been through a lot in the past hour, but now they were walking through the terminal with a renewed sense of respect, not only from the passengers around them, but from the staff, who were now walking on eggshells, carefully avoiding any further missteps. Melania, however, wasn't one to let things go easily. As they moved through the terminal, she could hear murmurs from passengers who had witnessed the earlier drama. Some were still in disbelief about how Barron had been treated, while others seemed to silently agree with the need for accountability. But Melania didn't want just apologies behind closed doors. She didn't want this to be forgotten by the end of the day. This was about change, and it needed to be a change that was felt by everyone. She wasn't just fighting for her son anymore. She was fighting for anyone who had ever been judged unfairly, treated poorly, or made to feel less than. At the gate, the airline staff, now visibly more accommodating, greeted Melania and Barron with offers of priority boarding and refreshments. But Melania didn't want their apologies or extra services. She didn't need compensation. What she wanted was for the incident to be remembered as a turning point, a reminder that respect isn't earned by status or name, but by the humanity shared between people. Barron glanced at his mother, her posture still regal as they were led to their seats. "I didn't expect all of that," he said quietly, breaking the silence between them. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of surprise in it, a reflection of the whirlwind they had just navigated. Melania, glancing up from her phone, gave him a soft smile. "You handled yourself well," she said, her voice soothing. "It's not easy to stay calm when everything feels unfair. But you did, and that's important." Barron nodded, still processing the weight of everything that had happened. "Yeah, but I never imagined something like this would happen," he admitted. "I mean, it's just a flight. Why did it have to turn into something like that?" Melania leaned forward, her voice low and thoughtful. "That's exactly the problem," she said. "No one should have to get used to being treated unfairly, whether it's you, me, or anyone. It's a reminder that respect doesn't depend on who you are or what your name is. It should be a basic right." Barron sat back, his mind turning over his mother's words. He had been caught in a storm he didn't ask for, but it was clear now that it wasn't just about him. This was bigger. This was about standing up against bias, standing up for fairness, and ensuring that no one would ever feel like they didn't belong because of their last name or background. The flight was smooth, but as they made their way to their destination, Melania reflected on what had transpired. She couldn't let the moment pass without sending a message to the world. She pulled out her phone and began typing, her fingers moving with purpose. A few moments later, a tweet appeared on her profile. "Today my son experienced something no one should have to endure, being judged before being understood. This serves as a reminder to treat everyone with dignity, no matter their name or background. Respect is universal. Let's do better." The tweet quickly gained traction, sparking a conversation online about bias, accountability, and respect in public spaces. Comments flooded in, some supportive, others critical, but most echoing the sentiment that fairness and dignity should be non-negotiable. Melania read through the replies, her face softening with each one. It was clear that this moment had struck a chord with people far beyond the walls of the airport. Her words had resonated, and that was exactly what she had hoped for. As the plane made its way through the clouds, Melania looked over at Barron, who had his headphones in, staring out the window. She smiled faintly, reflecting on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about the treatment Barron had faced. It was about everyone who had ever felt dismissed, judged, or unworthy. The experience had left a lasting impact, not only on Barron but on the passengers, the staff, and anyone who had witnessed it. It wasn't about the apology or the compensation. It was about the shift in how people viewed respect, and how quickly they were willing to judge. In the end, it was about teaching others to think before they acted, to pause, and recognize the humanity in everyone. "Do you think they'll actually change anything?" Barron asked, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Melania looked at him, her gaze steady. "Maybe not today, but moments like these add up," she said softly. "People notice, and sometimes all it takes is one person standing up to make others think twice." Barron nodded, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. He wasn't just a bystander in this world. He had the power to make a difference. As the plane continued its journey, Melania leaned back in her seat, her thoughts drifting to the future. This moment, however small it might seem, would have an impact. It was the beginning of a conversation that needed to happen. A conversation about fairness, dignity, and respect. One conversation at a time, they could make a difference. And as Melania closed her eyes, she knew this was just the start of something bigger. The lessons learned today would resonate far beyond the walls of the airport, and Barron had just been a part of something that would leave a lasting change in the way people saw each other. As we come to the end of today's story, I want to remind you that the characters and events in this video are fictional, created purely for entertainment. While the specific details of the narrative are not real, the underlying message carries weight. It's a story about standing up for what's right, holding people accountable for their actions, and never compromising on respect for others, no matter their background or status. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Respect is universal. It shouldn't depend on someone's name, position, or appearance. We should all strive to treat others with dignity and fairness, especially when it's difficult or uncomfortable. Moments like these, though small, can make a difference. It starts with one person, one conversation, and one act of kindness. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Your time and support mean the world to us. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you find today's topic intriguing, comment 1 below. If it doesn't resonate with you, comment 0. Your feedback helps us create better videos that match your interests. Thanks again for being part of our community, and I'll see you in the next video.